This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All, where my guest this week is Tim Christopherson, a forester, former UN environmentalist, and one of the leading voices behind the global ecosystem restoration movement, advocating for regenerative agriculture, nature-based solutions, and a much more joined-up approach to restoring the natural world. With the UK sweltering through multiple heatwaves, we talk about whether investment in nature can genuinely deliver the scale of restoration we need, and what happens when we start treating ecosystems as part of the financial system as well as living systems.
So my background is that I'm a forester by training, and I'm working now for a large technology company. I'm probably one of the very few foresters in that big company. But I was interested in nature restoration before I went to university. I think my first ecosystem restoration project was when I was 9 or 10 in my grandparents' backyard, restoring their pond. And at that time, I didn't know it was called ecosystem restoration, and I didn't know much about ecology, but that's why I studied forestry. It's always been a passion of mine. And then for about 20 years, I was in public service. I was first with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and briefly with the European Commission. And then 15 years, I was at the UN Environment Program running their Nature for Climate team. So anything that nature-based solutions can do for climate adaptation or mitigation, including saving tropical forests. We had a big program on that. And my last job at the UN was to set up the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which we're still in. We're actually in the middle of it right now. It's a decade 2021 to 2030. And then about 4 years ago, there was a big tech company that I didn't really know much about at the time called Salesforce that approached me because they were setting up a ambitious reforestation program with the World Economic Forum, and they asked for my advice and guidance. And they just kept calling me about, we now have made 100 million tree commitment. We have to restore forests. Who do we work with? Where do we focus? What does that mean? And at some point, they just said, why don't you come and work for us? Because we keep calling you anyway. So 4 years ago, I joined Salesforce, which is a world market leader in customer relationship management and has a very ambitious climate and nature strategy. So that's where I now am. One of my team's jobs is to plant or save an additional 100 million trees by 2030. And we're slightly over halfway there. So it's an interesting shift from the public to the private sector. And I can talk a little bit more about that when we go into the book of what that means for the solutions that we now need for climate and the climate and nature crisis that we're in.
Yeah, let's dig into that because, obviously Roots and All interviews are fairly short and I've got so many questions that I wanted to ask you. So I'm going to kind of paraphrase your book terribly, but basically, from my understanding, you are hoping that private investors will invest in ecosystem services. Is that right?
It's part of it. We need public and private investments. And it is, I would say it's my hope, but it's also already happening. There's private investments into nature-based solutions for climate change have gone up about 11-fold the last 4 years to slightly over $100 billion per year now. Of course, governments are still spending roughly $5 trillion in our taxpayer money in subsidies that often support harmful activities like fossil fuel extraction or industrial agriculture that depletes soil and erodes soil. So we also have a lot to do on the public sector side. But private investments in nature are increasing. In the book, I talk about the emergence of $1 trillion nature restoration industry, which we are starting to see. Regenerative agriculture is sort of in the lead, but there are the voluntary carbon market and other investments in nature that are catching up. So we are starting to see there's a lot of focus on nature, on healthy soils. And it's encouraging, but we still have a lot of work to do to accelerate that. We're in a race against time, as you know. You're in the, fifth heat wave in the UK now this summer. We have wildfires all across Europe. We don't have a lot of time.
Yeah, agreed. So if a private company was to invest in the restoration effort, what would they expect to see out of it?
So for big private sector companies, let's say the Fortune 500, the 500 largest companies in the world, many of them are now part of what is called the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures that screens how nature is material to our business. You take our case as a tech company, we use a lot of data center compute. Salesforce does not own or operate our own data centers, but we use a lot of compute. And for that, we need water to cool these data centers. So of the 100 million tree investments we're making, we've identified 13 priority watersheds where we're investing. One of them is the Greater London area. And this is what we would need to get out of nature investments. This is different for every single private sector actor, but one thing that many companies have in common is that they invest in climate adaptation, in water resilience, but also in climate mitigation through the voluntary carbon market. Nature-based solutions are a big part of the VCM, and we have made a commitment as Salesforce a few years ago with other tech companies to buy 20 million tons of high-quality nature-based removals. So these are large ecosystem restoration projects that produce not only community benefits and biodiversity benefits, but measurable carbon credits that we purchase and retire as part of our wider climate action portfolio. So we basically compensate for our ongoing emissions that we can't reduce yet.
Obviously, there are community benefits with these projects, but in terms of the private investors looking to get a benefit further down the line because it makes their business easier, I guess, again, I'm paraphrasing and that's probably simplifying it too much. But is it not an option for these companies who need the kind of ecosystem services to be functioning well to just stop their activities so that they don't need those kind of things in the first place?
It depends what company you're talking about, because one thing I've learned since joining the private sector, it's an extremely heterogeneous sector. There are no two companies that are alike, and they all have different needs. If you look at an agri-food company, for example, they will, of course, need a stable supply chain of agricultural products. So for me, that is the most promising part of the entire private sector is the agri-food industry, because they all realize that their supply chains are very fragile now with climate change. And ecosystem restoration can be one of the best responses. So we are helping, for example, a startup in Brazil to revolutionize the way agroforestry is rolled out at large scale in the eastern part of Brazil, restoring degraded cattle pasture lands and stabilizing supply chains for coffee, cocoa, bananas. There's over 40 products that are grown on these restored patches. And there, it's not the case that it's just about stopping a harmful activity. The delta for positive action is an active restoration, which will then also generate revenue and stable supply chains for the investors. So those are the types of activities we have to look for. Of course, there are also activities that if you stop them, like overgrazing or destructive factory farming, industrial farming activities, that would be enough to restore an ecosystem. But often it is more than that that is required.
So what I liked about kind of what you were talking about was that it was very long term, and we see, particularly in the UK, you'll get a change of government and you'll get a change of policy, and so many things just fall by the wayside because there's only this short term thinking. But that made me kind of ask the question, if it is a long term project, who owns the land? Say if you're restoring, I don't know, 50,000 acres of forest, who would own that land so that you can ensure that that long-term plan didn't get torn asunder at some point?
Well, the UK is a big country, and it's one country of many where this is now happening. It's difficult to generalize who owns land because the structure is different in many countries. What you're right about is that this is a long-term effort. In the book, I call for a century of ecology. Basically, this century, it will take all of us to restore planetary scale, ecosystem functionality, and it starts with ecological literacy. Before we go into who owns the land and who has the carbon rights, and again, this is endlessly complex and very different from Brazil to Colombia to the UK, we need to talk about what is our level of ecological literacy beyond the people who are actually working in this field, which I think includes many of the listeners, professional horticulturists and people working in this field. But what is the level of ecological literacy we need to see across society so that we can understand how we have a living relationship with the land and with nature? Humans are part of nature. I think we have to start there, which is at the root, which is like why I like the title of your podcast, which is at the root of our current crisis. It is more than about the mechanics of how to structure an investment deal. It is about the philosophy that underlines it. What makes us currently confused about whether we're part of nature or not is the outdated notion that only humans have a sort of divine spark and everything else is a commodity, which is what the philosophers of the Enlightenment era told us. And that is now 300 years old and very much outdated, but it's the basic logic of our extractive economy. So as long as we approach things with that mindset, I think we're not going to get far enough. So we need a more deeply rooted and fundamental change in how we view nature and view our role in nature. And of course, indigenous peoples have known this all along. And therefore, if you look outside of the UK and look at the tropics, the areas that are under most effective conservation and restoration are indigenous territories. And that is, of course, no coincidence. Where those rights of communities are strongest, you also see the strongest defense and recovery of nature.
I mean, actually, you do mention a project, which is one of your kind of case studies where they're doing regenerative agriculture. So taking that as an example, I believe you're parceling out, or not you, but, land is parceled out to people to start kind of effectively smallholdings. In that instance, who owns the land that those people are then becoming effectively tenant farmers on?
So this project is in India. It's in the state of Andhra Pradesh, in the south of India, and the state has about 55 million people. It's one of the Indian states, and of those, there are around 6 million smallholder farmers. They farm about 8 million hectares or 20 million acres. So each farming family only has a few acres. And that makes it very important that they have profitable livelihoods. What the Andhra Pradesh community-based natural farming initiative does is that the government has come in and is rolling out nature-based farming methods across now over 1 million farmers. And by not relying anymore on expensive outside fossil fuel produced fertilizers, they have made their farming much more profitable. It is much more resilient. Biodiversity has bounced back. Soil organic carbon has increased. They are much better prepared for the extreme weather events that are now happening in all parts of the world. And the government is trying to roll this out now to all of the 6 million smallholder farmers in Andhra Pradesh. So in this case, it is the smallholders who own the land. But what the government's role is, and that's really important, is both as an aggregator of the produce. And again, we're talking about dozens of different products and very small suppliers. So the government aggregates and then sells this at a favorable price to large commodity traders and agri-food companies. And the government also provides the basic training when this new farming method is rolled out. And it's not that they're using no pesticides at all. They're just producing all of that locally in the village. Neem paste, for example, to ensure they can respond to some of the pest outbreaks. There's no expensive external input required for the smallholders. Therefore, most of the profit from agriculture remains with the family. And that's been so successful that now even people from the city are starting to move back to the countryside because they have an economic future and livelihood alternative they see there. So they sort of save the climate and biodiversity as a byproduct of having more stable income as farmers. And in this case, there are also very few private investors because the government saves around $1 billion per year already in fossil fuel derived fertilizer subsidies, which they, before this change, had to subsidize and give to the farmers. So the government does this because they see a long-term investment in resilience, but also they save a lot of budget. The investor in this case is a large multilateral development bank called KfW, which is the German bank for reconstruction, and they've worked with the Indian government to ensure that transition. The government pays them back with the savings from the fertilizer subsidies.
So kind of, again, taking that case study, you said obviously that we need a kind of more joined up thinking when it comes to conservation efforts, regenerative agriculture. I think you know that project inside out from the way you've written about it. But in that instance, who would dictate what is the best way to manage that land in order to get the outputs that you're looking for, whilst also farming for biodiversity?
So the methodology they use in the community-based natural farming is now a couple of decades old. It's not a very new methodology. It's been designed by an Indian scientist who has then tested this over a number of years. There are many products that all can be made locally from local ingredients that are protecting plants or that are producing fertilizers. The key approach here is that all of this can be produced locally, so the money stays in the local economy, which is quite important. Of course, this does not work everywhere. You don't also have the same agricultural structures of smallholder farmers everywhere. Coming back to the example in Brazil, we are working, and I sit on the advisory board for the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration, working with one of the UN World Restoration flagships called the Mata Atlântica. So this is the eastern seaboard of Brazil, which used to be the third largest rainforest in the world. It was more diverse than the Amazon. And there's less than 10% left of it now. It's called the Atlantic Forest. And restoring that Atlantic forest over the next years would take around $60 billion US, probably more. And that, of course, is an amount that cannot just be paid out by the government. We need private sector investors who are coming in. And one of those investors is the company I mentioned called Courageous Land. They were just a startup a few years ago, but they're now growing very fast by offering the farmers in that part of Brazil a complete service of designing, planting, and if the farmers want, also managing agroforestry plots. So that's a different structure for a different part of the world, and their private sector investments play a more important role. I describe all of this in the book in more detail, and there are now about 20 world restoration flagships that the UN has designated where these large-scale restoration efforts are happening, with often regenerative agriculture as the driver, sometimes the voluntary carbon market, but often a blend of different investment options from different angles that are driving that restoration.
I mean, there's so much to it. I think that you mentioned at some point, so obviously the scientists have kind of thought about the best way to manage it. I think that you mentioned there was some kind of AI mapping that happened. And then as a result of all of this research, there was, I suppose, a good way of doing things that came out at the end of it. If you were, for example, a farmer on that land and you kind of did everything that was designated to be successful and you weren't then successful, is there the kind of fluidity in the scheme to change the way that you're managing the land if you find that it's not working for you individually?
That's always the key question, isn't it? Because farming usually is and that's, I think, partly why farmers are found to be so conservative. It's a decision that when you make it, mistakes have enormous consequences. In particular, if you plant trees, which is a long-term investment, but even choices for seasonal crops are very important. My family and I have a farm here in Denmark, so we're also in making those decisions and shifting from what used to be an industrial dairy farm to permaculture with agroforestry and livestock grazing. We use a method called adaptive multi-paddock grazing, basically short rotation periods of intensive grazing with sheep in our case, to restore soil biodiversity. If some of that does not work out, we are fortunate enough that I have a day job that can absorb some of the financial risk. If you're a farmer that doesn't have that luxury, that is, of course, where the transition should be subsidized with government funding. And let's not forget that across the EU, while the UK was still part of it, but now that the EU 27 spends 40 billion euros per year on the common agricultural policy, and the UK has similar policies to support land transition. So there is funding available that could buffer these transitions and the risks that farmers take. It's actually very important that we use government tax incentives in that way to shift and encourage that transition. So I also write in Generation Restoration about how we can shift some of these massive subsidies. There's enormous amounts of money spent on agriculture around the world each year by government funds, how we can shift these subsidies in a way that is supporting restoration, that's supporting local livelihoods, supporting biodiversity outcomes, climate stability, climate resilience. So it is feasible and the money is there. It's just often spent on the wrong thing at the moment.
I mean, I think you mention it in the book as well. There's this danger that we kind of romanticize these rural ways of life that are more simple, for want of a better word, and if you had, for example, a regenerative agriculture project or a project that required somebody to go and live on a manageable patch of land and carry out forestry operations, then you are looking for people to do that when actually, as we see kind of it, particularly in Europe, there aren't those people from the younger generations who are necessarily willing to go back and live from the land. So is that a stumbling block for some of these projects?
My impression, and I don't have data on that, but there is a bit of a sea change in how the younger generation sees agriculture as a profession. It is a hard profession, not only in terms of the work you do, but also in terms of all the things you need to know. It is a very complex field. It's very risky, increasingly so with climate change and extreme weather events. But nevertheless, there are a number of young people now going back into agriculture with a view to turning it into regenerative agriculture. If you go on Instagram right now and you search for hashtag Generation Restoration, there's about 150,000 posts about projects that are doing regenerative agriculture. You go on restore.eco, so restore without an E at the end, .eco. You'll find about 300,000 restoration projects all across the world, again, often linked to regenerative, mostly smallholder agriculture. And these are all people who are either young or young at heart and are moving into this space, maybe sometimes with a romantic idea, but you find out very quickly when you do actual restoration on the ground that this, it sounds more romantic than it is, but it is very rewarding and it is very fulfilling. So I see that there's a bit of a change, and in Europe and in the UK, that's of course much needed because our farming population is aging. The average age of farmers is now quite high across Europe. So we definitely need a generational shift in farming.
So if a private investor invested, and all companies are looking for a profit. So if they invested in a project that then did not produce a profit or, some sort of dividend in a certain amount of time, is there the potential that they could just pull out and then the whole, all the original investment kind of is for naught if that project then doesn't continue and, there aren't the subsidies perhaps available to people who've taken on the land or got involved in it? What happens in the event that it's not a success, in financial terms anyway?
There's a book that Ernest Hemingway wrote called The Sun Also Rises. And in it, there's a line where somebody asked, how did you go bankrupt? And the answer is in two ways, gradually and then suddenly. I think what we're seeing, of course, you can always lose an investment. That is part of investing in the private sector. It can happen in any sector at any given project. But what we're seeing with nature at large now is that nature is starting to be on the verge of bankruptcy. And when ecosystems are pushed into an ecological tipping point, that happens very quickly. You can gradually degrade an ecosystem for many years, but then one day it happens very suddenly that it tips into a new ecological state. And then, of course, your investments would be lost. So what we cannot allow is that our policies and our government investments are pushing nature and ecosystems countrywide, nationwide, worldwide to this brink of bankruptcy. And that is what we have to address. My book is not a guide for private investors how to invest in land management. It is more an understanding of humans are part of nature. We've forgotten that for too long, and we're now being reminded with warning signals like the heat waves, like the droughts across Europe, mega fires. So this is nature starting to declare bankruptcy at planetary scale. And this is something that none of us can afford, whether you're a private investor or a government or minister of finance. We have to collectively do something to change that. The private sector has a role in that. But the most important role at the moment is for all of us to make our voices heard and demand from public sector and from private investors that we change the way we invest. And it all starts with ecological literacy, which I describe in a few basic steps in the book.
Yes, you do. So to kind of leave it on a very positive note, which you do in the book, what would be your kind of thoughts in summing up? How can people get involved? Is there a role for individuals or is this more for corporations? What would be your advice moving forward? And I like the kind of the spin that you put on it at the end, which is, let's not kind of all panic and let's think positively moving forwards.
So there's two things. One is optimism is absolutely mandatory in this line of work, and not just unconditional optimism, which is a term that economist Paul Romer uses, but conditional optimism. Unconditional optimism is like a child waiting for presents, and that's not useful in our current state. It will not happen. That somebody just comes and bails us out. Conditional optimism is like a child wanting to build a tree house, and if you've ever had a kid focused on wanting to absolutely do something, it gets everybody mobilized, and we then all pitch in and pull together, and suddenly you're building something really cool. And that is the kind of optimism we need for global restoration of nature at significant scale. It's conditional optimism. Everybody can get involved. Go to restore.eco, find the nearest restoration project near you, or start your own. Or if you're doing one, upload it there. Say, I'm open for others to help, or even just exchange information. The immediate thing you'll see there is the realization that you're not alone. If you're working on restoration already, there are hundreds of thousands of people now doing this either full-time or with more and more of their time and their money. So it is a real movement that is starting. There's a groundswell of nature restoration, whether you call it rewilding or regenerative agriculture or other things. They're all part of a groundswell of this realization we are part of nature. And nature is eagerly responding to this. Nature is waiting for us. It's time to come home.
Thanks to Tim for sharing his thoughts on ecosystem restoration, regenerative agriculture, and the complicated relationship between nature and money. If you enjoyed today's episode, you might also like episode 318, Care Not Capital, and episode 58, A New Garden Ethic.
You'll find links to both in the show notes, and as always, thank you for listening. Next up is Benny with his Insect of the Week.
The Toadflax brocade moth. Scientific name, Calophasia lunula. So my insect of the week this week is a wonderful little moth. As the common name implies, it's associated with toadflax. And the etymology, the first word, the genus, Calophasia, comes from ancient Greek, kalos, deriving from beautiful, phasia, appearance. And then the second word, the descriptor, the epithet, is lunula. So that's Latin from moon. And that is related to the crescent kind of marking on the wing, or the half moon / crescent. It's one of those examples where the caterpillars are really striking and the moths are a bit kind of nuanced, really. I suppose you've got to like moths to appreciate it, and you've got to get your eye in to see the subtleties of how beautiful they are. But it is a lovely moth, and the caterpillars really are quite striking. It's a kind of former scarce migrant, and now it's a resident species with 2 generations in the UK. I'm not sure if it's present in Ireland at the minute, but it's all the way up to the north of England and possibly higher. Just the records show up to the north of England. It was restricted to the southeast of England, like really restricted in Dungeness, just on that kind of Kent coastline. And we think, this is what a lepidopterist told me, a really good moth guy called Sean Clancy, actually in Dungeness, and he told us that with kind of purple toadflax being much, much more prevalent in gardens, has allowed it to spread quite quickly across the southern half of the UK at least. So the caterpillars will use common toadflax, so Linearia vulgaris, as well as the purple toadflax, Linearia purpurea. So I think common toadflax is native and purple toadflax comes from the Med, I believe. So it's using both of those, which is quite good. And I really rate purple toadflax as well as common toadflax. I think they're both excellent plants. Really good garden plants, quite tough. Can kind of grow on waste ground soil, but also kind of roadside plants or even just kind of general garden plants in various soils. The caterpillars are very bright, like really bright, really striking, but they blend in surprisingly well. So you sometimes have to look at the plant, which I do whenever I see purple toadflax, and just try and stare at it for a while and see if you can spot the caterpillars, because even though they are striking, they do blend in really well with the seed pods especially. So they arrived in the UK in the 1950s, was really restricted, but has spread reasonably well. It overwinters as a pupa within a tough oval cocoon, and it sometimes will kind of stay in that state in amongst the seed pods. But I think it will also kind of find nice tucked away places like stones and posts and walls, which is more likely for the pupa. So I really hope you've seen one. If it's not something you've seen, then it's not too late. There's still caterpillars on the plants, and you may still see an adult if you're lucky. If you do see some, please do record on iRecord or iNaturalist.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.